Stay tuned for Butler on Business, coming up next on the Liberty Express.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Alan Butler, Butler on Business. Jason, would you please introduce Ian Gordon?
We are joined on the phone by economic forecaster Ian Gordon. He's the president of Long Wave Analytics.
Ian, how you doing today, buddy?
I'm very well, thank you.
Who do you provide these economic forecasts for?
Essentially for my subscribers to my website, which is longwavegroup.com.
Well, Ian, where do you think this is all going to head?
Well, I'm very pessimistic and have been for a long time now about the economy. My work has evolved around a Russian economist's work who wrote his thesis in the mid-1920s, Nikolai Kondratiev, and it's all based on a very long economic cycle. And we're now in that cycle. We're really repeating the depression of the 30s. Or we could say the depression that followed the 1873 stock market crash, or even going back to 1837. So we're in what we call the winter of the cycle, which is the payback period in the cycle when debt is wrung out of the system. Same occurred in the 1930s. The same occurred after 1873. So that process is extremely painful, both to creditors and debtors alike.
Now, do you believe that we're heading into a depression?
We would argue that we are in the depression. It's being masked by massive infusions of government money into the economy, and but we would say that the real unemployment numbers, for instance, in the United States are probably better than 16%. And we would say those are depression numbers. We eventually think that the stock market, too, will reflect the reality of the economy.
Ian, you're preaching to the choir here, buddy. On my way down to the station this morning, I was explaining to a friend of mine that by the original term of a depression, we actually have slipped into a depression. When you go back and look at these benchmark adjustments that the government is using with this propaganda they're pumping out, we have now actually retroactively, the trough was depressionary in its magnitude. And I had been describing a period, the Native Americans here referred to it as Indian summer. It was a little warm up. You know, you had a cold snap, then you'd have a little warm up, and then we'd have the real winter. And then what we have, I guess you could say, enjoyed in the last year and a half was this Indian summer, or if a hurricane is hitting, you know, that's when the eye of the storm is sitting on top of you. You know, suddenly the clouds break, the sun comes out, and you feel like the worst is over, and then you get hit with the back half of the hurricane. And both of those analogies were applicable to our current economic predicament. And I would say then that you share that view. We're beginning that next leg down.
Well, I certainly do. I mean, we really haven't gone through the process of essentially getting most of the debt out of the system. I mean, a lot of the debt that has been in the system has been taken over by the federal government, so their debt is absolutely astronomical. The process of eliminating that debt has just got underway. The government has tried to sort of intercede by printing copious amounts of money to sort of try and get the system going again, but unfortunately the U.S. consumer is completely tapped out, so it's going to be very hard to get the U.S. consumer back into the economy until that debt has been wrung out of the system.
What, according to the cycle in the long wave, where are we? Like in baseball analogy, what inning are we in, you think?
Well, we're in the winter season of the cycle. We call it the winter, which is the time when the economy dies, and you have to wait until spring before you get the rebirth of the economy, and the rebirth occurs because debt has been wrung out of the system. I mean, you could say that the rebirth of our present economy started in 1949 after the Second World War, because we were in a depression that was somewhat held back. You know, the war eliminated to every extent, really, the the Depression. But going into the war, U.S. unemployment was still in double-digit numbers. And so we say that the present cycle started in 1949 with the spring, and the whole cycle is about 60, 70 years long. So each of the seasons, the 4 seasons, are approximately 15 to 20 years long. So we're in the beginnings of the winter. So we're probably in the second or third innings of the winter in a baseball analogy.
So we have maybe 3 or 4 more years of heading towards the bottom before we can start to look for a legitimate recovery?
I think it's going to be much longer than that because we've got to get this debt out of the system. And that process is, the debt is so enormous. Worldwide debt is enormous. I mean, you're seeing the repercussions of that debt, in Europe. I mean, all the European countries are in dire straits because of the massive amounts of debt that they've taken on, and that puts their banks in jeopardy as well, because all these banks, these European banks, have massive amounts of debt paper on their books, and that's really, to a large extent, why the European governments, and particularly Germany, are trying to save the euro, because they know that if the euro goes, their banks go too.
Ian, are there any things that the average investor can be doing to not only protect their wealth but actually, prosper or profit during this winter cycle, or is it down for everybody?
Well, we've been advocating since 2000, a position in gold, and for my own self, I've been 100% positioned in gold. In gold and gold equities since 2000. So I'm talking about 100% because I believe that the stock market is going to go into a massive bear market like the 1929-32 stock bear market, but gold stocks and the precious metal are going to perform as they did between 1929 and 1936 outstandingly well. People are going to be in that medium because they don't trust paper. I truly believe that we're going to go back to a gold standard system anyway, because the whole paper money system is in a state of collapse.
I don't know that, with this central bank mechanism that we have here, the politicians are so tied into having a central bank to create the money so they can spend. I don't know that they have the political will to break them. For them, it'd be like, executing their drug supplier.
I think that's a great analogy right there. But I think that the Federal Reserve was set up in 1913 as a result, really, of the 1907 stock market crash and the failure, essentially, of the New York banks. And Knickerbocker Trust failed in 1907. The stock market Dow dropped by 50%, and J.P. Morgan bailed out the bank's failures at that time, and they vowed that they would like to see a central bank made responsible for this in the future. So the Federal Reserve was set up as a result of that 1907 crash. So in 2007, we predicted that this was the end, because it was a 100-year anniversary of the 1907 crash. There were other anniversaries occurring in 2007. We wrote a piece saying this is it. We said the financial system was going to collapse, and the stock market would make a peak, and it too would collapse. And so we did that as a result of the 1907 crash.
Well, one of the things that I had hoped is that we would implement the necessary reforms to avoid the crisis, but I have come to the conclusion that any reforms we do get will be because of the crisis. In other words, they're going to continue to play this game, our politicians, until we are knee-deep in the crisis, and then hopefully they'll begin to implement the reforms that are necessary. I mean, we were, for the longest time, us first, and then prior to us, the British were the economic powers of the world, and I just hate to see us slipping like we are.
Well, again, I think that every major power or supreme power in the world has always been the greatest creditor nation. So you could say that essentially that these sort of levels of power have lasted about 100 years. So you could argue that Britain, in the 1800s, the United States in the 1900s, and then once you go from the biggest creditor nation in the world into a debtor nation, and Britain, of course, when it became a debtor nation after the First World War and a big debtor nation, and the United States really started to become a debtor nation in the mid-1980s, that sort of you go into a waning power mode, and the next leading country takes over, and that leading country is always the greatest creditor nation, and that at this point in time happens to be China.
Ian, you've been a great guest. We'd love to have you on again. Jason, tell them how they can get to Ian's website.
Yeah, I've been thumbing through some of the publications that you guys have on longwavegroup.com, and it's some really good stuff out there, some great information. So I'd urge anybody who's interested in these ideas to check out longwavegroup.com. We've been speaking with Ian Gordon, who is the president of Longwave Analytics.
Ian, thank you very much. Please come on again.
Thank you very much for having me.